The screams were not human. They tore through the damp, heavy air of the tropical island, shrill, full of primal fury, containing no words or meaning, only a pure, animal threat. The Carthaginian sailors, men whose faces were tanned by the salt winds of all known seas, from Tyre to Gades, froze, clutching their weapons. Their eyes, accustomed to the endless blue of the ocean and the gold of desert shores, now stared in horror into the emerald twilight of the jungle, from where this chilling sound emerged. Their leader, Hanno the Navigator of the Magonid clan, stood on the bow of his flagship Pentaconter, and even his hardened heart skipped a beat. He had led his armada of 60 ships and 30,000 souls beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the edge where maps ended and monsters began. He had seen rivers boiling with fire and mountains spewing flames into the heavens, which his men called the chariot of the gods. But what he saw now did not fit into any myth. From the thickets, creatures covered in thick black fur stared back at them, walking on 2 legs, but with the wild grace of a beast. They were larger and stronger than any man. The males bared enormous fangs, beat their chests with their fists, letting out that same deafening roar, while the smaller females clutched their young. Trembling with fear, the translators from the Lixite tribe whispered a single word: gorillas. At that very moment, in the 5th century before Christ, on an unnamed island off the west coast of Africa, 2 worlds, separated by millions of years of evolution, met. Hanno, a pragmatist and a colonizer, gave an order that would trouble and horrify historians for centuries: take them captive. But the males proved so ferocious and strong that they had to be killed. The sailors managed to capture only 3 females. This cruel, strange trophy, the skins of these unseen creatures, would become the main proof of his incredible journey, the greatest geographical discovery of antiquity. And at the same time, this moment would become the starting point for oblivion. Here, in the cry of a wild beast, a legend was born that would eventually swallow historical truth, turning a triumph of cartography into a bizarre fable, and the discoverer's name into a footnote in the margins of history. How could this have happened? How could the man who gazed beyond the edge of the world 2,000 years before Vasco da Gama be almost completely erased from the pages of time? The answer to this question is hidden not only in the jungles of Africa, but in the very heart of his native city. To understand Hanno's audacity, one must see the world through his eyes, a world divided not just by swords, but by fear. The Mediterranean of the 5th century BC was a boiling cauldron of civilizations, a vast chessboard where any move could be the last. In the east, the Persian Empire, a colossus with feet of clay, stretched its shadow from the Indus to the Aegean, threatening to engulf the freedom-loving Greek city-states. The Greeks themselves, eternal rivals and debaters, were sinking their teeth into the coasts of Italy and Sicily, founding colonies and challenging anyone who dared dispute their maritime dominance. And on the African shore, in the curve of the Gulf of Tunis, stood his city, Carthage. It was not just a capital, but the pulsating heart of a trading empire built on the legacy of its Phoenician ancestors from Tyre. Carthage was a wolf in the sheep's clothing of a merchant. Its strength lay not so much in legions as in ships, and, more importantly, in secrets. The routes to the tin mines of Britain, to the sources of amber in the Baltic, to the gold deposits of Africa, these were all state secrets, guarded better than the city walls themselves. Knowledge was power. Knowledge was gold. And in this world, there was an invisible but absolutely real boundary: the Pillars of Hercules, the rocks of Gibraltar. For most Greeks, and even for many Phoenicians, this was the limit of the universe, beyond which began the ocean, a boundless, eternal chaos teeming with monsters, surrounding the flat disk of the inhabited earth. To venture beyond the pillars was to challenge the gods, to commit an act of sacrilege and madness. But for Carthage, this boundary was not an end, but a beginning. They were the only ones who dared to cross it regularly, turning the fear of others into their main competitive advantage. It was in this world where the map ended at the threshold of the Atlantic, where power was measured not only by the number of warriors, but by the length of trade routes, that Hanno was born. He was a product of a civilization that saw the ocean not as a barrier, but as a road, and understood that whoever controlled that road would rule the world. His expedition was not an act of pure curiosity. It was a calculated, cold, and desperate move in the great geopolitical game, a gamble that would either secure Carthage's greatness for centuries to come or swallow it in the very mythical waters that everyone so feared. Hanno was no upstart or adventurer who rose from the bottom. Behind him stood the shadows of centuries and the power of one of Carthage's greatest clans, the Maganid dynasty. To be a Maganid was to carry in your blood the very essence of Phoenician civilization, a blend of a merchant's grip, a priest's wisdom, and a general's ruthlessness. His ancestors created this empire, stretching from Sicily to the coast of Spain, an empire built not on conquest for glory like the Persians, but on pragmatic control of trade hubs. He was the heir of a people who 1,000 years before him invented the alphabet not to write poems, but to keep trade records. In his veins flowed the blood of the same seafarers from Tyre and Sidon who first mastered navigation by the North Star, turning night from a time of terror into a time of travel. But there was another, deeper and more unsettling legacy, a whisper passed down from generation to generation. A century and a half before Hanno's birth, as the chronicles of the Greek historian Herodotus attest, the Egyptian pharaoh Necho the Satant hired Phoenician sailors for an unimaginable task, to circumnavigate Libya, as they called Africa, starting from the Red Sea and returning through the Pillars of Hercules. They completed the task. Their journey took 3 years. They told incredible stories, that while sailing around the southern tip of the continent, the sun was on their right hand, meaning to the north. Herodotus himself, recording this story, considered it an implausible fabrication. But for us, their descendants, it is the main proof of the truth of their voyage. For Hanno and his contemporaries, this story was not just a tall tale. It was both a challenge and a reproach. His ancestors had done it, but they had done it in the service of a foreign king. The knowledge they gained brought no wealth to Carthage. It was a missed opportunity, an unfinished task that hung over the entire maritime aristocracy of the city. Hanno, like any ambitious member of his class, was obsessed with the idea of surpassing the deeds of his fathers. He had to not just repeat their journey, but do it for the glory and, more importantly, for the profit of Carthage. He had to turn the legend into a map, the myth into colonies and trading posts. His expedition was not just a journey in space, but a journey in time, an attempt to reclaim and multiply a lost heritage, to prove that the blood of the ancient seafarers had not run dry, but was ready to spawn a new, even greater triumph. In the world of Carthage, commerce and religion were woven into an inseparable knot. Every trade contract was sealed with an oath to the gods. Every new colony began with the construction of a temple, and every military campaign required divine approval. At the center of this pantheon stood the stern Baal-Hamon, the lord of the brazier, god of fertility and weather, whose favor was the key to the city's prosperity. But Baal-Hamon was a demanding deity. His will was interpreted by the priests, a powerful caste whose influence was comparable to that of senators and generals. And in the middle of the 5th century BC, the priests began to sound the alarm. They pointed to signs that everyone could see. The city was overpopulated. The streets, designed for fewer inhabitants, were clogged with people. The inland territories, the fertile valleys of modern-day Tunisia, could no longer feed the growing population. A social explosion was brewing. The poor, without land or work, were becoming a powder keg ready to ignite at any spark. The priests interpreted this not as an economic problem, but as a sign of divine anger. Baal-Hamon was displeased. He demanded that his people not sit behind the city walls, but go forth, carrying his name and power to new lands, as their ancestors had decreed. This religious rhetoric became a powerful ideological weapon in the hands of those, like Hanno, who saw the solution in expansion. The expedition beyond the Pillars of Hercules was presented to society not as a risky commercial venture, but as a sacred duty, an act of appeasing the gods. The 30,000 colonists Hanno would lead were not just settlers, but participants in a sacred act, pilgrims going to cultivate the promised lands granted to them by Baal-Hamon. This religious aspect was critically important. It transformed the fear of the unknown into religious ecstasy. It justified the colossal expenses and risks. It gave Hanno not just the authority of an admiral, but the aura of a messiah fulfilling a divine will. The prophecies and omens spoken of in the temples created a sense of inevitability and predestination for his mission. And when his fleet left the harbor of Carthage, it was not just the departure of an expedition. It was a religious exodus, a crusade on water, where every stroke of the oar was a prayer, and every new mile sailed south was a sacrifice offered on the altar of the prosperity and divine glory of their purple empire. It was this synergy of pragmatic calculation and religious fanaticism that made the unthinkable possible. Hanno's character was forged in the very heart of Carthage, in a melting pot where the smells of exotic spices from the market, incense from the temples, and the salty sea breeze from the port all mixed together. His childhood was spent not in idleness, but in rigorous training befitting the heir of a ruling dynasty. On one hand, he was a merchant to his very core. From a young age, he mastered the science of profit and loss, learning to read not only geographical maps, but political ones as well. He watched as his father and uncles negotiated with Numidian tribal chiefs, trading cheap trinkets for ivory and slaves, how they struck complex trade deals with Etruscan princes and Greek merchants, where every word carried the weight of gold. He absorbed the main principle of Carthage. Information is worth more than any commodity. A map of a new trade route, knowledge of a metal deposit, intelligence about a competitor's weakness. This was the true currency of their world. And he learned the art of secrecy, the ability to say much without revealing anything of substance, because a revealed secret is a lost profit. On the other hand, he was raised in deep reverence for the gods. He attended rituals in the temple of Baal-Hamon and his consort, Tanit, the city's patron goddess. He saw how the most powerful men in Carthage humbly bowed their heads before the priests. He understood that power was not just about money and ships, but also about the ability to control people's faith, to channel their fears and hopes in the right direction. This duality, the cold pragmatism of a merchant and the mysticism of a believer, created the unique alloy that was Hanno. He could spend hours studying the starry sky, calculating a ship's course with mathematical precision, and at the same time, he could order a sacrifice to appease the sea gods before a storm. He was capable of ruthless cruelty if the interests of business demanded it, as in the case of the guerrillas. Yet he also felt he was the executor of a great mission, predestined from on high. This crucible of character prepared him for the ultimate test. When he led his fleet into the unknown, he would need all these qualities: the mind of a merchant to find profit in wild lands, the faith of a priest to inspire desperate men, and the will of a general to lead them through the gates of hell and back again. He was not just a navigator. He was the embodiment of Carthage itself, a city of merchants who prayed to the gods of profit. Before Hanno could challenge the ocean, he had to win a far more treacherous and unpredictable battle, a battle within the walls of the Carthaginian Senate, known as the Council of 104. Here, in a cool hall adorned with purple fabrics, the fates of the empire were decided, and words were sharper than swords. His project, a massive expedition to colonize the Atlantic coast of Africa, was met with fierce opposition. Opponents, led by representatives of old, conservative clans whose wealth was based on established Mediterranean trade routes, put forward compelling arguments. They called the plan madness and sacrilege. Where did he intend to lead 30,000 free citizens? Into the jaws of sea monsters from fables? To sun-scorched shores with no water or food? They spoke of the wrath of the gods, who had set the Pillars of Hercules as a limit for mortals. But behind the religious rhetoric lay cold economic calculation. They feared not the gods, but the colossal expense. 60 pentaconters, months of provisions, payment for the crews, equipment for 30,000 colonists. All this required a huge investment that could bankrupt the treasury. Why risk real gold for mythical lands? They demanded. This was the first serious test for Hanno, where he had to display not the courage of a sailor, but the talent of a politician and strategist. He did not argue with their points. Instead, he launched a counterattack, appealing to the two greatest fears and ambitions of the Carthaginian elite: fear of the people and the lust for profit. He presented intelligence reports about growing discontent in the city's overpopulated quarters. He painted vivid pictures of a coming rebellion that would sweep them all away if the poor were not given new land and new hope. He turned the colonists from a burden into the solution to the main social problem. And then he moved on to the main point: profit. He spoke not of mythical lands, but of specific goods. He unfolded before the senators the tales of old Phoenician captains, about rivers carrying golden sand, about forests teeming with elephants bearing precious ivory, about countless tribes ready to trade all this for Carthaginian goods. He transformed a risky venture into a brilliant investment with manifold returns. He managed to convince them that the fear of the unknown was nothing compared to the fear of missing out on profit. This victory in the Senate, won by the power of words and logic, was no less important than any naval battle. It showed that Hanno was not just a dreamer, but a leader, capable of uniting a nation around an ambitious goal. He got his ships and his people. Now all that was left was to prove that his promises were more than just beautiful rhetoric. Behind the facade of public good, religious duty, and geopolitical ambitions lay a deeper, almost primal motivation that drove Hanno and the entire Carthaginian elite. It was hunger. Not the hunger of the stomach, but the hunger of an entire civilization that had reached the limits of its growth within its given borders, and now faced a choice: either expand by breaking through the shell of the known world, or begin to devour itself from within. Carthage, for all its wealth and power, was a parasite city, its prosperity entirely dependent on external sources. Its agriculture, though advanced for its time, could no longer feed the rapidly growing population of the capital and its surroundings. Every crop failure, every drought, threatened famine riots. The city needed new lands, new granaries that could guarantee food security. But even more acute was the hunger for resources. The entire economy of Carthage was built on processing and reselling raw materials. It needed metals for building ships and making weapons, silver and tin from Spain and Britain. It needed precious woods for the luxury furniture so valued in the markets of the East. It needed ivory for inlays and works of art. It needed slaves to work in the fields and mines. And most importantly, it needed gold, the universal equivalent of power, with which one could hire armies, bribe chieftains, and finance new ventures. The old sources were gradually being depleted, and competition with the Greeks for access to them was becoming fiercer. Hanno, as a representative of the ruling class, understood this threat better than anyone. He saw that Carthage's economic engine was beginning to run idle. A new, powerful influx of resources was needed, which could only come from a breakthrough into a completely new, untouched region. Africa, lying south of the known trade routes, was this last reserve. Stories of its immense riches, though semi-mythical, stirred the imagination. Hanno's expedition was not an act of goodwill or scientific research. It was a desperate attempt to crack open a new safe, to find a new source of sustenance for a hungry empire. The 30,000 colonists were not just settlers. They were an instrument for securing a foothold in new territories, for creating a network of trading posts and outposts that, like tentacles, were to dig into the body of the African continent and begin siphoning its lifeblood. This was his inner demon, his secret but all-consuming motivation. The cold, ruthless hunger of a civilization standing on the edge of an abyss, willing to do anything to survive. The preparation for the expedition became a project of national scale, a demonstration of all the organizational and industrial power of Carthage. It was not just assembling a fleet, but creating an entire world in miniature, ready for autonomous existence for many months. At the heart of this enterprise was an armada of 60 pentaconters. These were not bulky merchant ships, but swift, maneuverable warships, each propelled by 50 rowers seated in a single bank. The choice of this ship type was no accident. Pentaconters had a shallow draft, allowing them to approach unfamiliar shores and enter river mouths, yet they were seaworthy enough to withstand the waves of the Atlantic. Each ship was a work of art and engineering, built of Lebanese cedar and Cyrenean pine, with seams caulked and tarred for maximum water resistance. But the ships were just empty shells. They had to be filled with life, and that life was numbered at a staggering 30,000 people. These were not just sailors and soldiers. Hanno recruited entire families, craftsmen, farmers, builders, women, and children. He understood that successful colonization required not temporary outposts, but full-fledged, self-sufficient settlements capable of putting down roots in new land. Recruiting such a number of people was a titanic task in itself, requiring persuasion, propaganda, and promises. Recruiters went through the overcrowded quarters of Carthage, painting pictures of a new life on fertile lands, where everyone could receive their own plot. Then began the logistics phase, a feat of imagination. The ships had to be loaded with provisions for many months, thousands of amphorae with wine, olive oil, and water, sacks of grain, dried fish, and salted meat. In addition, tools for construction were loaded aboard: axes, saws, hammers, weapons for defense, spears, swords, shields, and most importantly, goods for trade with the natives: bright fabrics, glass beads, ceramics, and metal goods. The entire harbor of Carthage turned into a giant anthill, where thousands of people worked day and night, subject to the single will of Hanno. He personally controlled every stage, from the quality of the rivets on the ship's hulls to the composition of the food rations. He understood that in the coming voyage, any small detail could prove fatal. This armada, slowly taking shape in the harbor, was not just a fleet. It was an ark, carrying the genetic code of Carthaginian civilization, ready to set sail beyond the edge of the world to found a new empire or perish without a trace in obscurity. The moment of departure was staged with maximum solemnity and drama. The entire city seemed to pour onto the walls and into the port to see off Hanno's armada. The air buzzed with the hum of voices, mixed with the cries of gulls and the commands of foremen. Priests in purple robes performed the final sacrifices on altars at the water's edge, calling upon Baal-Hammon for protection and upon Melkart, the patron god of seafarers, for a favorable wind. Smoke from the sacrificial fires drifted over the water, mingling with the salt mist. For the 30,000 colonists and sailors standing on the decks, this was the moment of final rupture with their past lives. They were leaving behind everything they knew: their homes, their streets, the graves of their ancestors. Ahead lay only a vast, terrifying unknown. As the fleet, formed in a strict column, passed the breakwaters of the Carthaginian harbor and set a course westward along the African coast, the first test was not a storm, but psychology. The journey to the Pillars of Hercules was familiar and routine, but everyone knew this was just a prelude. The real journey would begin where the Mare Nostrum, our sea, ended. And then that day came. On the horizon, two giant shadows grew: the rocks of Gibraltar, which the Greeks called the Pillars, set by Hercules himself as a mark of the limits of human endeavor. For the crew, this was not just a geographical point, but a mystical gateway to another world. Beyond it, according to belief, began the boundless ocean, where the sky meets the water, where giant serpents capable of swallowing a ship whole reside, and where the sun is so close to the earth that the water boils. Crossing this threshold was an act of incredible courage, bordering on madness. Hanno, understanding the state of his men, ordered another ritual. A bull was slaughtered on the flagship, its blood staining the blue waters of the strait, a final tribute to the gods of the known world. Hanno himself raised a prayer, his voice, amplified by the wind, carrying over the flotilla. He spoke not of fear, but of glory, not of monsters, but of riches, not of death, but of the new life that awaited them on uncharted shores. He was transforming an act of sacrilege into an act of faith. And when the last ship of his armada passed through the strait and entered the broad, powerful waves of the Atlantic, a deafening silence fell. They had done it. They had leaped into the abyss. Now there was no turning back. Ahead lay either a triumph that would make them legends or oblivion in the endless waters that no map had ever known. Hanno's first and main task after breaking into the Atlantic was not a thoughtless journey south, but the creation of a bridgehead, a chain of strongholds that would become the foundation of Carthage's new overseas empire. He was not a lone explorer, but a strategic colonizer. He understood that without reliable bases in the rear, any advance into the unknown was doomed to fail. Following the coast of modern-day Morocco, he methodically chose sites for future settlements. He was interested not just in convenient bays, but in locations that met three key requirements: a source of fresh water, fertile land for agriculture, and defensibility. After 2 days' sail from the Pillars of Hercules, the first city was founded, named Thymiaterion, which can be translated as Altar of Incense. The name was symbolic. It was the first altar established by Carthage on the shores of the ocean. Several thousand colonists disembarked from the ships. Under the guidance of military engineers, they immediately set to work, setting up camp, building fortifications, and laying out the future streets and a temple. Hanno left behind not only inhabitants, but also a strong garrison and a portion of the supplies. Thymiaterion was to become the main administrative and logistical center of the new province. Then the fleet moved further south. At intervals of several days' sail, other colonies were founded: Karikon Tychos, Gita, Akra, Melita, and Arambis. Each was settled by a portion of the colonists from the Armada. This process was like a spider weaving its web. Each new colony became a knot in this network, connected to the mother city and neighboring settlements by sea. These cities served several vital functions. Firstly, they were agricultural centers that in the future would supply food not only for themselves, but also for passing Carthaginian ships. Secondly, they were trading posts, points of contact with the local Berber tribes, with whom trade was gradually established. Thirdly, they were repair bases for the fleet, where one could replenish water supplies, repair a damaged hull, or replace a worn-out sail. By creating this chain of 7 new Carthages, Hanno solved the main strategic problem. He had firmly established a foothold on the new coast. Now, his further voyage south was not a leap into the void, but a movement along his own newly created coastline. He could take risks, knowing that in case of failure or storm, he had a place to return. Leaving the newborn colonies behind, Hanno's armada continued its journey south, soon reaching a large river he named the Lixus. Here, at its mouth, where fresh water mixed with salt, the first significant encounter with the indigenous population of these lands took place, a nomadic tribe which he called the Lixitai in his report. This contact was a moment of truth on which the further success of the entire expedition depended. Without guides and interpreters, further progress would have been blind and deadly dangerous. Hanno approached this with utmost caution. He did not land an armed force. Instead, he ordered one ship to slowly enter the river and drop anchor at a safe distance from the settlement visible on the bank. Gifts were brought out onto the deck: bright fabrics, copper jewelry, amphorae of wine. This was the universal language of trade, understood without words. The Lixitai, who at first watched from a distance with suspicion, gradually grew bolder. Their chief, in a small boat, approached the Carthaginian ship. Long and complex negotiations began, conducted with gestures and drawings in the sand. To Hanno's surprise and great fortune, it turned out that the Lixitai had had contact with Phoenicians in the past. They had preserved in their memory fragments of the language of the Carthaginians' distant ancestors. This was a real breakthrough. The communication barrier, though with difficulty, was overcome. Hanno spent several days with the Lixitai. He did not just trade, he studied. He questioned them about the lands lying further south, about other tribes, about rivers and mountains, about dangers, and about where the most valuable goods, primarily gold, could be found. The Lixitai, friendly and impressed by the power of the Carthaginian fleet, willingly shared information. They told of high, forest-covered mountains ahead, of silent Ethiopians with whom one could trade without seeing their faces, and of wild, hairy people living on islands. In the end, Hanno persuaded several Lixitai to join his expedition as guides and interpreters. This was his greatest achievement at this stage. These men became his key to Africa. They were his eyes and ears, his bridge between the known and the unknown. With them on board, he was no longer a stranger in a wild world. Now he could move forward, with at least a vague idea of what lay ahead. As Hanno's fleet, having left the hospitable Lixitai, moved further south, it entered a completely different dimension, where the laws of nature seemed to have changed. The coastline, previously green and welcoming, turned into an endless, sun-scorched strip of desert, beyond which nothing could be seen but a shimmering heat haze. This was the edge of the Sahara, meeting the ocean. The days became unbearably hot. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, heating the ship's decks so much that it was impossible to walk barefoot. The pitch holding the hull planks together melted and ran, spreading a pungent smell. At night, A piercing cold set in. But the most frightening thing was not this, but the psychological pressure of the unknown. The sailors, who had grown up on the shores of the Mediterranean, where one's own or another's coast is always visible, where the sky and constellations are familiar from childhood, found themselves in a world of frightening anomalies. They sailed along a shore where not a single sign of life could be seen. No wisp of smoke from a fire, no fishing boat, no human figure. Only dead rocks and yellow sand stretching to the horizon. At night, strange sounds echoed from the coastal cliffs, howls and laughter, which the superstitious sailors took for the voices of evil spirits. By day, they saw fires, not from human campfires, but giant bushfires, the smoke from which clouded the sky. Fear began to take hold of the crews. The old myths of a burning sea they had heard in the ports seemed to be coming to life. They felt they had reached the antechamber of hell, that the sun was getting closer every day and would soon incinerate their ships. Murmuring began. The men, exhausted by heat, monotony, and fear, started asking questions. Why were they sailing further? Wasn't it time to turn back before the gods became utterly enraged? This was a critical moment when the entire expedition could have ended in mutiny. Hanno had to display all his will and leadership qualities. He doubled the wine rations to lift their spirits. He organized rowing competitions to distract them from their dark thoughts. But his main weapon was his word. He would gather the crews on deck and speak to them. He did not deny the dangers, but presented them as a trial sent by the gods to test their courage. He reminded them of the riches that awaited them and the glory they would cover themselves with upon their return home. To them, he was simultaneously a ruthless commander, a caring father, and a high priest. He managed to maintain discipline and quell the panic. He made them row on, into the very heart of their fears, into the scorching kingdom of the sun, where each new day was a victory not so much over the ocean, but over their own terror. After an exhausting passage along the desert shores, when it seemed this hell would never end, an incredible, terrifying, and majestic sight opened up before the weary sailors, one that would be forever seared into their memory. One night, as the fleet lay at anchor in a wide bay that historians today identify as the coast of Cameroon, the earth trembled, and the sky to the east lit up with a crimson glow. The sailors ran onto the decks in a panic, thinking the end of the world had come. In the distance, on the mainland, a high mountain they had previously seen as a dark silhouette against the stars had turned into a pillar of fire. From its summit, with a deafening roar, streams of flame and incandescent rocks erupted, while wide, fiery rivers flowed down its slopes towards the sea. It was a volcanic eruption, most likely Mount Cameroon, one of Africa's most active volcanoes. But for people of the 5th century BC, who had never seen anything like it, this was not a geological phenomenon. It was a divine event, or a demonic one, the air filled with the smell of sulfur. Ash began to settle on the decks and sails of the ships. The roar coming from the shore was like the bellowing of 1,000 monsters. The sailors fell to their knees, praying to all the gods they knew. They were certain they had reached the gates of the underworld, the very burning sea of legend. In their eyes, Hanno had led them straight into hell. At this moment, panic could have finally destroyed the expedition. But Hanno, perhaps shaken to the core himself, found the strength to turn terror into awe. Using his Lixite interpreters and the priests who were on the ships, he gave this phenomenon a name and a meaning. He declared that these were not the gates of hell, but a divine sign, a manifestation of the power of their patron, Baal-Haman, the god of fire and the sky. He named this place Theon Okema, the chariot of the gods. This psychologically brilliant name transformed the source of fear into an object of religious worship. They were not at the gates of hell, but at the foot of their god's throne. This moment became the climax of the entire journey. It showed the sailors how far they had come, what a different, primordial world they had entered, and it elevated Hanno's authority to the heavens. A man who not only did not fear the fiery mountain, but also spoke on behalf of the gods, seemed to them a supernatural being. They were ready to follow him anywhere. The sight of the chariot of the gods became the main legend they would bring home, proof that they had been where mortals were not meant to be. Advancing further south, into the region known today as the Gulf of Guinea, the Carthaginians faced a new problem. The local tribes, living deep in the tropical forests, were extremely timid and avoided direct contact. Upon seeing the large ships approach, they would simply disappear into the jungle. This threatened one of the main goals of the expedition: trade, primarily the acquisition of gold. It was here that Hanno and his men employed an ancient and unique Phoenician practice known as silent or dumb trade. This method, described even by Herodotus, was a brilliant solution for establishing commercial ties in the complete absence of trust and a common language. The process resembled a carefully orchestrated ritual. The Carthaginians would land on the shore and lay out their goods in a visible place. These could be bolts of bright cloth, ceramic pottery, salt cakes, which were highly valued in the continent's interior, or simple metal tools. After arranging the goods, they would get back into their ships and sail to a safe distance, sending up a smoke signal to indicate that an offer had been made. After this, the local inhabitants would emerge from the jungle. They would approach the goods, inspect them, and next to each group of items that interested them, they would place a certain amount of gold dust or other products valuable to them, such as ivory or exotic animal skins. Then they too would leave, disappearing back into the forest. In the next stage, the Carthaginians would land again. They would approach their goods and look at the payment offered. If the amount of gold satisfied them, they would take it, leave the goods in place, and immediately sail away. This meant the deal was done. If, however, the payment seemed insufficient, they would touch neither the gold nor their goods and return to their ships again. This was a signal to the locals that more gold needed to be added. The cycle could be repeated several times until both sides reached an agreement. This system, seemingly primitive, was in fact based on the highest level of honesty and trust. Any attempt to cheat, to take both the goods and the gold, would have immediately and forever destroyed this fragile link. For the Carthaginians, this was the only way to gain access to African gold, bypassing middlemen. For the local tribes, it was a safe way to obtain desired goods without the risk of being enslaved or killed by the newcomers. Hanno's use of this method demonstrates a deep understanding of the psychology of cross-cultural contact, and that his main priority was economic gain, for which he was prepared to follow complex and lengthy rituals. After the successful experience of silent trade and the mystical contemplation of the chariot of the gods, Hanno's expedition reached the southernmost point of its route. In his report, Hanno writes that they reached a bay called the Southern Horn and landed on an island full of strange life. This island, according to most modern researchers, could have been somewhere off the coast of Sierra Leone or Gabon. And it was here that the event occurred, which would become the most famous and most controversial episode of the entire journey. The island was covered with a dense tropical forest, and strange sounds emanated from its depths. When the Carthaginians, proceeding with caution, ventured into the forest, they encountered a whole tribe of human-like creatures that their Lixite interpreters called gorillae. Hanno describes them as wild people, whose bodies were completely covered with hair. He notes that the males were extremely aggressive, defending themselves by throwing stones at the newcomers, and were so strong that it was impossible to capture them alive. The sailors had to use their weapons to fight them off. However, they managed to catch 3 females. But here, too, a surprise awaited them. The females proved to be no less ferocious. They bit and scratched with such fury that it was impossible to hold them. Faced with a dilemma, to let them go and be left without proof, or to find a way to bring them to Carthage, Hanno made a cruel but pragmatic decision. He ordered the females to be killed, and their skins to be removed and salted for transportation. This episode sparks much debate. Who were these gorilla? Were they actually gorillas, as we know them today? Or were they chimpanzees? Or perhaps, was it some primitive pygmy tribe whose appearance and behavior so astonished the Carthaginians? Most scholars lean towards the version that they were, indeed, great apes, most likely chimpanzees, as the habitat of gorillas is further from the coast. The word gorilla, used by the interpreters, was probably their local name for these creatures. For Hanno and his men, this encounter was a shock. They had come face to face with a life form that blurred the familiar line between human and animal. The act of killing and skinning, which seems barbaric to us today, was for them the only way to document and prove their discovery. These skins were to be the main exhibit in his report to the Senate, irrefutable evidence that he had been where no civilized man had ever been before. He did not yet know that this very detail, intended to confirm the truth, would in the future become the source of the most absurd fictions and distortions. Having reached the southern horn and captured his exotic trophy, Hanno found himself at a crossroads, facing the most difficult decision of the entire expedition. On one hand, his explorer's zeal and ambition pushed him further. What lay beyond this cape? Was there an end to this continent? Could it be circumnavigated, as his ancestors, according to legend, had done in the service of Pharaoh Necho? The temptation to go down in history as the man who solved the world's greatest geographical mystery was immense. He had already come so far that it seemed just one more push would get him to the goal. But on the other hand, the heavy burden of responsibility weighed on him. He was not just a captain, but a leader responsible for the lives of thousands of people. And the reality was grim. The expedition had been going on for many months. Supplies of food and, most critically, fresh water were running out. The ships, worn out by the long voyage in tropical waters, where shipworms were particularly active, needed serious repairs. The men were physically and morally exhausted. Diseases, caused by the unfamiliar climate and food, began to claim lives. To continue sailing under such conditions would have been sheer suicide. Hanno, as a true Carthaginian, was a pragmatist, not a reckless adventurer. He weighed the potential glory of a full circumnavigation of Africa against the real risk of losing the entire fleet and all his people. He also understood that his main task was not geography, but economics. He had already founded colonies, established trade contacts, and found sources of valuable goods. The main goal had been achieved. Now, the results, and the information about them, had to be brought back to Carthage. A dead hero needs neither gold nor new lands. After much deliberation, perhaps after consulting with his captains, he made the only correct, though painful for his pride, decision. He gave the order to turn back. This moment, likely not described in his dry report, was full of internal drama. It was the moment when great ambitions collided with harsh reality, when the dreamer gave way to the responsible leader. He voluntarily gave up the chance for absolute immortality for the sake of saving his people and securing the future of his homeland. This decision characterizes him no less than all his courage and audacity. He found the wisdom to stop in time, securing his victory rather than chasing the ghost of the impossible. If the journey south was a battle against fear and the unknown, the return trip became a grueling race for survival against nature itself. It seemed as though the ocean, having allowed them to penetrate its secrets, now didn't want to let them go. Problems began almost immediately. The prevailing winds and currents, which had been favorable on the way down, were now hostile. The rowers had to work at the limit of human strength, battling the mighty Atlantic waves that pushed the ships back. The sails, which had been so helpful before, were now almost useless. This turned the voyage into a slow, torturous process, where every mile north was gained with immense effort. The problem with supplies became critical. The stocks of grain and salted meat were depleted. The main diet became fish that could be caught, and the meager supplies that could be replenished on shore. But stopping was dangerous. Relations with local tribes, which had been neutral on the way there, could now turn hostile upon seeing the weakened newcomers. Several attempts to land for water ended in skirmishes, where the Carthaginians lost several men. To physical exhaustion were added diseases. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamins, began to cut down the men. Tropical fever, contracted in the south, claimed the lives of dozens of sailors. The ships turned into floating hospitals, filled with the groans of the sick and dying. Hanno, watching his fleet and his people dwindle, had to make harsh decisions. The most damaged and slowest ships, which delayed the entire flotilla, had to be abandoned, with the survivors and valuable cargo redistributed among the other vessels. It is likely that at this stage, he lost at least a third of his original fleet. This was the darkest period of the expedition. The triumph of discovery was replaced by a desperate struggle for life. But it was under these conditions that the spirit of the Carthaginian sailors and their leader was fully revealed. Discipline, despite everything, was maintained with an iron fist. Their navigational experience allowed them to stay on course even in the most difficult conditions. And then, after weeks or even months of agonizing travel, familiar outlines appeared on the horizon. It was them, the Pillars of Hercules. Never had the sight of these rocks brought such relief and joy. They were back. They had escaped from the jaws of the ocean. They had survived. Hanno's return to Carthage was an event that shook the entire city. When the surviving ships of his armada, battered by storms, with weathered sails, but proudly raised standards, entered their home harbor, they were met by crowds of jubilant people. Rumors of their return had preceded the fleet itself, and the entire city, from the simple dock worker to the most noble senators, poured out onto the waterfront. They had been thought lost, swallowed by the mythical ocean, and their appearance was akin to a resurrection from the dead. Hanno came ashore not as an exhausted captain, but as a triumphant victor returning with a conquest. His report before the Senate was met with rapturous applause. He spoke of the colonies he had founded, which would become new sources of wealth for the Republic. He described new trade routes and the practice of silent trade, which promised untold flows of gold. He told of the incredible wonders they had seen, the chariot of the gods, rivers teeming with crocodiles and hippos. But the main, most tangible and shocking proof of his words were the trophies that were brought into the chamber at his command. They were 3 large, crudely tanned but well-preserved skins of those very gorillas. The senators, pragmatic men rarely surprised by anything, approached and examined these strange exhibits with astonishment. The thick black fur, the almost human proportions, the enormous size. They had never seen anything like it. It was irrefutable proof that Hanno and his men had been to another, otherworldly realm. By a decree of the Senate, these skins were given to the temple of Baal Haman as an offering to the gods in gratitude for the successful completion of the mission. They were hung in a prominent place and became the city's main attraction. People came to the temple to see with their own eyes the skins of the monsters from beyond the edge of the world. Hanno himself reached the pinnacle of fame and influence. He became a living legend, a man who had pushed back the boundaries of the world and brought his city hope for a new golden century. His name was on everyone's lips. It seemed that his feat was forever inscribed in the annals of history in golden letters. But the irony of fate was that at this very moment of deafening triumph, the first seeds of future oblivion were sown. The glory and the evidence, displayed for all to see, were only the visible part of the iceberg. The true results of the expedition, the maps, the pilot books, the detailed descriptions of trade opportunities, were already being prepared to become the most closely guarded secret of the Carthaginian Republic. Hanno was not only a navigator, but also a statesman who understood perfectly well that history is written not only with the sword, but also with the stylus. He recognized the magnitude of his achievement and wished to immortalize it for posterity, for the glory of his clan and his city. By his order, a detailed official report of the expedition was compiled, known to history as the Periplus of Hanno. The word Periplus in antiquity denoted a specific genre. It was not simply a literary description of a journey, but rather a pilot's guide, a practical manual for seafarers. It contained information about distances traveled in days of sailing, about directions, about geographical landmarks such as capes, rivers, and mountains, as well as brief descriptions of the tribes encountered and their customs. It was a dry, business-like document, devoid of poetic embellishments, but priceless in terms of practical information. To give this report the greatest possible weight and ensure its preservation, Hanno ordered its text to be carved on a large stone, or, according to other sources, a bronze stele. This stele was erected in the most sacred place in the city, the Temple of Baal Haman, right next to the very skins of the gorillas. This act had a deep symbolic meaning. Firstly, it was an offering to the god, a dedication to him of the greatest achievement accomplished under his patronage. Secondly, it was a public declaration of triumph, visible to every inhabitant of Carthage. Thirdly, Hanno believed that stone or bronze was a guarantee of eternity. Paper scrolls and papyri burn, wooden tablets rot, but an inscription carved in stone seemed to him eternal. He wanted that 100, 1,000 years later, anyone who entered this temple could read about his voyage and marvel at the courage and glory of the Carthaginians. In this decision, one can see the entire duality of his nature and his era. On one hand, he makes his report as public as possible, displaying it for all to see in the main temple. He craves fame and eternal memory. But on the other hand, he and his government would do everything to ensure that the most valuable part of the information from this report, the precise navigational data, maps, and pilot books that would allow competitors to repeat his route, never left the secret archives of Carthage. The stele in the temple was for the people, for history, for the gods. But the real maps were for business, for profit, for preserving a monopoly. And Hanno did not yet suspect that this very text, carved in stone and meant to preserve his story, would ultimately, after a chain of tragic events, become the only thing that remained of it, but in such a distorted form that it would almost destroy the very essence of his achievement. As soon as the celebratory fanfares died down, and Hanno's name became synonymous with a national hero, another invisible work unfolded in the quiet offices of the Carthaginian Senate. The great discovery had to be turned into great profit, and for that, it had to be turned into a great secret. The ruling elite of Carthage, raised on the principles of trade monopoly, understood perfectly well that the main treasure Hanno brought back was not the skins of exotic animals or even the first ingots of African gold. The main treasure was knowledge. Knowledge of safe routes, the location of colonies, the customs and languages of native tribes, the sites of silent trade. This knowledge was the key to exclusive access to the riches of West Africa. If this information fell into the hands of their main competitors, the enterprising and audacious Greeks, who were already pushing them out of Sicily, or the cunning Etruscans from Italy, the entire economic benefit of the expedition would be nullified. A gold rush would begin, in which Carthage would have to fight for every gram of gold. Therefore, a strategic decision was made to classify everything of practical value. The detailed nautical charts drawn during the voyage were placed in a secret archive, accessible only to a narrow circle of individuals. Captains of merchant ships sent on the new route were given only fragmentary instructions, and they themselves swore an oath of non-disclosure under penalty of death. Any attempts by foreign spies to glean information were brutally suppressed. The public version of events, inscribed on the stele in the temple, was deliberately composed to capture the imagination, but not to provide practical guidance. Distances were indicated in days of travel, which was a highly inaccurate measure dependent on wind and currents. Geographical names were local or specially invented to confuse outsiders. It spoke much of monsters and savages, but almost nothing of the commercial side of things. It was a brilliant disinformation campaign. Carthage was, in effect, telling the world, "Yes, we have been there. It is a terrible, dangerous place, full of monsters. You should not go there. But we, the great and brave, will sail there from time to time to bring back curiosities." This strategy of silence became the first shadow to fall upon Hanno's feet. His discovery was deliberately hidden from the world by his own people. Carthage chose profit over fame, monopoly over historical truth. The irony is that in trying to keep their discovery for themselves, they took the first step toward it being lost to everyone, including themselves in the future. Despite all the Carthaginians' efforts to keep their discovery secret, information, like water, always finds a crack. It was impossible to completely conceal an expedition of such scale. The sailors' stories, though embellished, were passed from mouth to mouth in port taverns. Greek merchants trading with Carthage heard these stories and passed them on. And most importantly, the text of the Periplus from the stele in the temple did become known outside of Carthage. It is likely that some Greek traveler or merchant who knew the Punic language was able to copy it or retell it from memory. Thus, the Greek translation of the Periplus of Hanno came into being, the very single document that has survived to this day. And here, Hanno's feet encountered a second, even more destructive force, the force of cultural misunderstanding and loss in translation. The Greek author who worked with the text was a man of a completely different culture. He was not a navigator, did not know the realities of the Atlantic coast of Africa, and viewed the world through the prism of his own mythology. The dry, businesslike report of the Carthaginian admiral began to transform in his retelling into a collection of exotic fables. A whole series of fatal distortions occurred. The most famous example was the gorilla. The Greek translator, not knowing what these creatures were, and perhaps influenced by myths of the Amazons, translated the word not as hairy beings, but as hairy women. Thus, a real encounter with great apes turned into a fantastical story about a tribe of wild women whom the Carthaginians could not tame. This completely shifted the focus from a zoological discovery to an ethnographic curiosity in the spirit of Greek myths. The Chariot of the Gods, a majestic but perfectly explainable volcanic eruption, in the retelling began to look like some mystical vision, confirming that the Carthaginians had reached the lands where the gods dwell. Practical details, such as silent trade, were either omitted as insignificant or described as a bizarre ritual of savages. As a result of this transformation, the document turned from a practical guide into entertaining reading for an educated Greek. It lost its scientific and navigational value. It began to be quoted not as a historical source, but as an example of curious tales about distant lands, alongside stories of people with dog heads or a single leg. This second shadow of oblivion was perhaps even more terrible than the first. If Carthaginian secrecy simply hid the truth, the Greek interpretation distorted it beyond recognition, turning the greatest geographical discovery into a curious fable. Hanno's feat ceased to be a fact and began to turn into a myth. While Carthage jealously guarded its African secrets, and Greek authors turned Hanno's report into a fairy tale, a new third force was gaining strength in the west, on the Apennine Peninsula, a force destined to become the gravedigger not only of Hanno's feat, but of his entire civilization. This was the Roman Republic. Initially a small city-state in central Italy, Rome possessed an indomitable will to expand and a unique capacity for organization. Unlike Carthage, which built its empire on maritime trade and control of coastal trading posts, Rome was a land power. Its might was based on legions, road construction, and the systematic absorption and assimilation of neighboring peoples. Over several centuries, Rome subjugated all of Italy and cast its gaze beyond its borders. And the first thing it encountered was Carthage. Their interests were bound to intersect on the island of Sicily, a rich and strategically vital piece of land that lay exactly between Rome and Carthage. For Carthage, Sicily was the jewel of its trading empire, a source of grain and an important market. For Rome, control of Sicily was a matter of security, a way to prevent a Carthaginian invasion, and a step toward dominating the Mediterranean. Conflict was inevitable. It smoldered for decades, expressing itself in local skirmishes and diplomatic intrigues. But in 264 BC, it erupted with a new, unprecedented force. The First Punic War began, the first of 3 wars that would become a titanic struggle to the death between 2 civilizations. This clash changed everything. For Carthage, the focus of attention shifted dramatically. The distant and risky Atlantic expeditions, which required enormous resources, were relegated to the background. All forces, all money, all ships, and all people were thrown into the war with Rome. Admirals who could have been leading flotillas to the golden shores of Africa were now leading them into battle off the coast of Sicily. Shipyards that could have been building exploration vessels were now building warships. The gold brought from Africa was now used to pay mercenaries. The rise of Rome marked the beginning of the end for the Carthaginian era of great geographical discoveries. The geopolitical storm gathering from the north was so powerful that it threatened to sink not just one ship or one expedition, but the entire Carthaginian project. The First Punic War, which lasted for more than 20 years, became a real meat grinder for Carthage. Accustomed to fighting with foreign hands, hiring Celtic, Iberian, and Libyan mercenaries, it faced an adversary with an almost inexhaustible pool of manpower and a fanatical devotion to its republic. The war exhausted Carthage's treasury and claimed the lives of tens of thousands of its citizens and allies. As a result, Carthage lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, and was forced to pay a huge indemnity to Rome. It was a blow of colossal force, but not a fatal one. The spirit of Carthage was not broken, and this spirit found its embodiment in the Barcid family, and above all, in the military genius Hannibal. He saw that revenge was inevitable and dedicated his entire life to preparing for a new, decisive battle. While Rome consolidated its position, Hannibal created a new Carthaginian province in Spain, which became his base and source of resources. In 218 BC, he began the Second Punic War, making his legendary crossing of the Alps with an army and war elephants. For 15 years, he waged war on Italian soil, inflicting one crushing defeat after another on the Romans, the most famous of which was the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal brought Rome to the brink of total destruction. But his feat had a downside. The entire might of the Carthaginian nation, all its resources, all its passion, were concentrated on this land war in distant Italy. The ocean was forgotten. The projects for the colonization of Africa, started by Hanno, were finally curtailed and abandoned. The colonies he founded fell into decay or were assimilated by local tribes, left without support from the mother city. The knowledge of sea routes, already secret, was now preserved only in the memory of a few old men, with no one to pass it on to. While Hannibal was performing miracles on the battlefield, his civilization was losing what made it great: its maritime spirit, its thirst for the unknown. In the end, Rome, despite all its defeats, endured. It moved the war to Africa, and Hannibal was forced to return to defend his home city. At the Battle of Zama in 222 BC, he suffered his first and last defeat. The peace terms were even more humiliating than before. Carthage was stripped of all its overseas possessions, forbidden to have a navy, and barred from waging war without Rome's permission. It was a death sentence. The path to the Atlantic, opened by Hanno, was now closed to Carthage forever. Even after the crushing defeat in the Second Punic War, Carthage, stripped of its empire and navy, managed to survive and even achieve economic prosperity again through its trade and unique agriculture. And it was this economic miracle that proved to be its undoing. In Rome, a generation was growing up raised on stories of Hannibal's atrocities, a generation for whom Carthage was an existential threat that had to be destroyed, once and for all. The voice of this hatred was Senator Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, who ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same phrase, "Ceterum censeo Carthaginem esse delendam." Furthermore, I believe that Carthage must be destroyed. This phrase, repeated over and over, became a mantra that prepared Roman society for the final, decisive act of the tragedy. A pretext was quickly found. Carthage, suffering from raids by its neighbor, the Numidian king Massinissa, who was an ally of Rome, was eventually forced to retaliate militarily. Rome immediately accused Carthage of violating the peace treaty and declared war, the Third Punic War. This was no longer a war, but a systematic annihilation. In 149 BC, a Roman army landed in Africa. The Carthaginians, realizing they had no chance, tried to buy their way out. They surrendered all their weapons. But Rome's demands were an ultimatum: abandon the city and settle far from the sea. For a people of sailors and merchants, this was tantamount to death. They chose to die in battle. A 3-year siege began. The entire city became a fortress and a military factory. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Slaves were freed and put into service. The Carthaginians fought with the desperation of the doomed, but the forces were too unequal. In 146 BC, the Romans under the command of Scipio Aemilianus stormed the city. A week of slaughter in the streets followed. After that, Scipio gave the order that fulfilled Cato's will. The city was plundered and burned to the ground. The fire raged for 17 days, turning everything to ash: houses, palaces, temples. Along with the city, its memory also burned. In the flames perished the great libraries of Carthage, its archives containing priceless information on history, geography, and agronomy. And somewhere in there, in the flames that consumed the temple of Baal-Hamon, the very stele with Hanno's Periplus crumbled to dust or melted. The physical carrier of the knowledge was destroyed. This was the third, final, and most terrible shadow of oblivion. Secrecy had hidden the knowledge, translation had distorted it, but it was Roman fire that erased it from the face of the earth. Now, nothing remained of the greatest discovery of antiquity, but a vague, distorted retelling in the books of its enemies. After the fire of the Third Punic War had cooled and the ashes had scattered, only ruins remained where the great city once stood. The Romans even performed a ritual, sowing the ground with salt so that nothing would grow there again. Along with the city, its unique civilization of seafarers also perished. Now, all that was left of Hanno's great voyage was a single document, that same brief and distorted Greek retelling that had circulated through the libraries of the ancient world for centuries, and the fate of this text became the final act of the drama, a true irony of history. The original, carved in stone, was destroyed. The maps and detailed pilot books, kept in secret archives, were burned. The only thing that survived was the most unreliable, most fantastical version, which was originally intended not for navigators, but for the entertainment of curious readers. Authors of the Roman era, such as Pliny the Elder, quoted this text in their works, but they treated it not as a serious historical source, but rather as a curiosity, an example of the fables told about distant lands. The story of the hairy women into which the gorillas had been transformed elicited more of a smirk from them than scientific interest. Thus, Hanno's feat was definitively pushed from the realm of history into the realm of mythology. It was placed on par with Odysseus's voyage to the Cyclopes or the Argonaut's journey for the Golden Fleece. It was an interesting tale, but no one in their right mind would use it as a guide for an actual voyage. A complete inversion had occurred. The very thing that was done to immortalize the feat, the creation of a public stele, ultimately, through a chain of tragic coincidences, served to discredit and obliterate it. The legend defeated history. The fantastical image created by the Greek translator proved to be more resilient than the real achievement of the Carthaginian admiral. And when, many centuries later, European scholars of the Renaissance began to rediscover ancient texts, they would stumble upon this strange account and would also be unable to separate truth from fiction. Hanno's feat survived, but it survived as its own distorted reflection, as a bizarre shadow no longer resembling the outline of what it truly was. The fate of Hanno himself, like the fate of his report, dissolves into the mists of history. We do not know when or how he died. Most likely, he ended his days in honor and wealth in his native Carthage, surrounded by the glory of his great journey. He died confident that he had secured his city's future for centuries to come and had inscribed his name in eternity. He could not have foreseen that in just a few generations, a storm would erupt that would sweep away everything he had created. He never learned that the colonies he founded would fall into decay, that his people would be drawn into a series of deadly wars, and that, in the end, his very city would be wiped from the face of the earth. His death, unnoticed against the backdrop of the great upheavals to come, became a symbol of the twilight of an entire era. With him and his generation, that unique Carthaginian civilization that looked west toward the ocean was passing away. A new civilization was taking its place, the Roman one, which looked east and south, but only by land. The Romans were brilliant builders of roads, aqueducts, and empires, but they were land-based people. For them, the sea was a means of transporting legions and goods, but not an object of exploration. The Atlantic, into which Hanno had so boldly stepped, once again became for them what it had been for the early Greeks, a frightening boundary of the world, the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. Their interests lay in developing already known lands, Gaul, Britain, Germania, Parthia. Spending resources on risky voyages along the seemingly desolate coasts of Africa was irrational for them. Thus, with the death of Carthage, the world seemed to shrink back. The door to the Atlantic, which Hanno had pushed ajar, was slammed shut and locked for almost 2,000 years. His feet died with his world, and therein lies the deepest tragedy of his story. His discovery was so revolutionary and ahead of its time that the civilization that succeeded his own was simply not ready to perceive, comprehend, and continue it. It preferred to retreat to familiar boundaries, leaving beyond the Pillars of Hercules only a realm of myths and fears. After the fall of Rome and the onset of the Middle Ages, the world closed in on itself even more. European cartography degenerated to the level of primitive, schematic maps, where Jerusalem was at the center of the world and the ocean was inhabited by dragons and sirens. The knowledge of ancient geographers like Ptolemy was largely lost or survived only in the Arab world. In these conditions, the story of Hanno's voyage, preserved in the works of Pliny, seemed not just a fairy tale, but a blasphemous heresy. The idea that one could sail so far south and not fall off the edge of the earth or burn up in the sun's fire contradicted both religious dogma and common sense. And so it continued for centuries. It took a whole series of revolutions in shipbuilding, in navigation, in thinking, for Europe to dare to face the ocean again. And then, in the 15th century AD, almost 2,000 years after Hanno, Portuguese navigators under the patronage of Prince Hanno the Navigator began their methodical attempts to explore the coast of Africa. They moved slowly, step by step, from cape to cape, battling the same fears as the ancient Carthaginians. For them, this was an absolute discovery, a journey into complete unknown. They didn't know that they were following in the footsteps of their distant predecessor. Every island they discovered, every river mouth, seemed to them the first contact in history between civilization and these lands. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama, having rounded the continent, reached India, opening the sea route to the east. This was called the Age of Great Geographical Discoveries. And only later, when historians and scholars of the modern era began to study ancient texts more carefully, did they notice the strange Periplus of Hanno. Comparing his descriptions with new, accurate maps, they began to realize with astonishment that it was not a fairy tale, that the descriptions of rivers, mountains, deserts, and even the chariot of the gods coincided with the real geography of West Africa with striking accuracy. And then came the shocking realization. 2,000 years before the great Portuguese, someone had already made this journey. History had come full circle, and humanity had to rediscover, with great effort and sacrifice, what had once been discovered, but then lost. The 2,000-year pause in the exploration of Africa became the most vivid and tragic monument to Hanno's forgotten feat. Now, having traveled this long path through the centuries, we can finally assemble all the pieces of this historical mosaic and give a final, exhaustive answer to the main question posed at the very beginning. How could the greatest discovery of antiquity be forgotten for almost 2,000 years? The solution to this paradox lies in the fact that the memory of Hanno's feat was struck not by one, but by 3 consecutive devastating blows, each fatal in its own way. The first blow was the economic secrecy of Carthage itself. Its civilization, built on trade monopoly, valued profit more than historical glory. They deliberately hid and classified the practical results of the expedition, leaving for public display only a pompous but uninformative report. They themselves hid their treasure from the world, hoping to enjoy it exclusively. They were the first to begin turning geography into myth to scare off competitors. The second blow was the cultural distortion by the Greeks. When the information did leak out, it fell into a foreign cultural environment where it was misunderstood and distorted. Greek scribes, acting without malicious intent, but in accordance with their worldview, filtered out all the scientific and practical from the report, leaving only the exotic and mythological. They turned a zoological discovery into a story about wild women, and a geological phenomenon into a divine miracle. They completed the process of turning fact into legend that the Carthaginians themselves had started. And the third, decisive blow was the physical destruction by Rome. Carthage's age-old rival, Rome, in its total war of annihilation, wiped from the face of the earth not just a city, but its entire material culture, including its archives and libraries. The fire that consumed Carthage in 146 BC destroyed the primary source, the stone stele with the Periplus, and more importantly, the secret maps and pilot books. This act of genocide and cultural vandalism was the point of no return. It physically destroyed the evidence. Thus, Hanno's feat became the victim of a perfect storm, was destroyed by the greed of his own people, the misunderstanding of strangers, and the hatred of his enemies. He opened up an entire continent to the civilized world, but his own civilization did everything to hide the map to this world. Another turned that map into nonsense, and a third burned it to ashes. In this tragic sequence lies the complete answer to the paradox of Hanno, the discoverer whose discovery was lost to the world. The story of Hanno the Navigator is not just a tale of one courageous journey. It is a deep and troubling parable about the very nature of knowledge, about its fragility and vulnerability. It shows us that human history is not a straight line of continuous progress, but a complex, pulsating process, full of breakthroughs and setbacks, discoveries and losses. We are accustomed to thinking that once a discovery is made, it stays with us forever, that knowledge can only accumulate. But Hanno's fate proves the opposite. Entire universes of knowledge, entire maps of being, can be created and then completely lost, erased from the collective memory of humanity so that they have to be discovered anew, from scratch, millennia later. This story makes us wonder how many other lost discoveries are hidden in the sands of time. How many other Hannos were there in history, in Babylon, in Egypt, in China, in pre-Columbian America, whose achievements were swallowed by wars, fires, and oblivion. The feat of the Carthaginian admiral teaches us that knowledge is not just information. It is an entire ecosystem that requires not only the genius of a discoverer, but also a society capable of preserving that knowledge, interpreting it correctly, passing it on to future generations, and, most importantly, using it. Without this ecosystem, any discovery, no matter how great, is doomed. It turns into a curiosity, a fairy tale, a dusty scroll on the shelf of a forgotten library. Hanno gazed beyond the edge of the world, but the world was not ready to see what he saw. His story is an eternal reminder that progress is not guaranteed. It is a fragile flame that must be constantly tended, protected from the winds of ignorance, fanaticism, and war. For, as the fate of Carthage shows, the most terrible fire is not the one that burns cities, but the one that burns libraries, leaving behind not just ruins, but a void in the memory of humanity, a gaping hole that then takes centuries to fill.